Everything begins with meeting Edward Gein, better known as Eddie or Edine, a man with a strange attitude since he was a child. When he is discovered, he manages to escape before anyone can recognize him. Already at home, he takes his mother's bra and starts jerking himself off, making noises that catch her attention. His mother, upon hearing him, corrects him by reciting a verse from the Bible, and warns him that he must not get involved with women, since it is a sin. The next day, Eddie meets a friend. She is Adeline, who shows him photographs of corpses from the Nazi war. The images full of lifeless bodies together with some comics of a woman named make a deep impact on Eddie, so much so that same night he decides to read them obsessively. The next morning, his older brother Henry confesses that he is in love with a woman. Eddie replies that he cannot have a relationship because of the religion that rules the family. Henry, upset, tells him that those rules are not for him, that his mother is crazy, and that Eddie should take his own path. These words enrage Eddie, who in an impulse hits him hard with a piece of firewood, believing he has killed him. However, Henry wakes up and retracts what he said about his mother. But the next day, when Eddie returns to the farm, he finds his brother dead. Everything he believed had been a simple misunderstanding was real. Desperate and not knowing what to do, he decides to set the farm on fire to cover up the death. The police and the neighbors come to help, and the events end up going unnoticed. The blow is devastating for the family. Eddie's mother cannot bear the pain of losing a son, and her health begins to deteriorate. Eddie then takes on the role of caring for her. A few days later, his mother gets up to collect a debt from a neighbor for having farmed on their land. In the middle of a family argument, she tries to set things in order in a strange way. Every word she speaks stirs memories in Eddie until suddenly she falls lifeless. After the funeral and mourning, Eddie tries to pull himself together. He knows that life must go on, and he returns to work on his farm. However, at night, loneliness consumes him. One of those nights, he dresses in his mother's clothes and repeats her strange habits until he hears a voice, hers, whispering that he can bring her back. Driven by that obsession, Eddie runs to the cemetery, where his mother lies, and begins to read passages from the Bible over her grave. Between tears and delirium, he begins to desecrate the burial. Then, his mother's voice orders something even more disturbing, to dig up the corpse that is next to her. Without thinking, Eddie obeys, takes the body to his house, and with it, seals the beginning of an even darker spiral. The next day, Eddie begins to see disturbing visions, Jews escaping from soldiers right in front of his house. He joins them convinced that they have discovered him and that in reality, they are chasing him. But it is all nothing more than a hallucination caused by his schizophrenia. Where does that darkness come from? Eddie's childhood explains a lot. He was born in 1906 in Wisconsin. At school, they taught him about wars, and from a young age, he was fascinated by macabre comics of severed heads in crime magazines. As an adult, the comics that Adeline gave him became triggers for his illness. Not only did he begin to desecrate corpses, but also to remove their skin, imitating Ilse, the villain of his favorite comics. With that skin, he makes in chairs. Now, Eddie leads an apparently calmer life, although deep down, he knows he needs a woman to help him with household chores, since he lives in complete disorder. One night, he goes out skating with Adeline. They talk for a long time until they get to the subject of crimes. For her, that is an object of study. For him, a dark fascination. Driven, Eddie confesses that he has done things inspired by Ilse's comics. She does not believe him, but agrees to go to his house to check. Upon arriving, she finds absolute chaos and encourages him to be more orderly. While she cleans the kitchen, Eddie declares his love and asks her to be his girlfriend. She gladly accepts, convinced that at last someone understands her. Later, they go up to Eddie's mother's room. On the way, Adeline notices something disturbing, a chair with human skin. Dismayed, she enters the room and runs into his mother's decomposing body. Eddie insists that she is only asleep and that Adeline is being rude to her. Horrified, Adeline flees the house. Eddie, upset, begins to argue with his dead mother, since in his mind she is still alive, and scolds him for getting involved with women, reminding him that they are a sin. Desperate, he goes to a bar, imagines being at a party like in his comics. Suddenly, he pulls out a gun and shoots the woman who tends the place. Then he takes the body to his house. The next morning, the police investigate the bar, and a witness claims to have seen Eddie's truck. Over the years, his story reaches Hollywood. There we meet Anthony, a talented actor who has the role of Ed Gein, and Alfred Hitchcock, the writer of the film inspired by Eddie. Touring the sets, they arrive at Eddie's house just as it was found, showing the cruelty in every hallway. Alfred Hitchcock. Alfred Joseph Hitchcock was a British film director, producer, and screenwriter. A pioneer in many of the techniques that characterize the genres of suspense and the psychological thriller. After a successful career in British cinema in silent films and early sound film, which led him to be considered the best director in England, Hitchcock moved to Hollywood in 1939. More. When the film is released, the images are so shocking that the audience leaves the theaters. Back to Eddie's life. After the crime at the bar, the police visit him at his house, but he is dressed in his mother's clothes and skin, cleaning compulsively. When he opens the door, he quickly changes to give statements. He denies having been at the bar and manages to convince them with his words. Shortly after, he runs into Adeline, who apologizes for having left his house so abruptly. Eddie blames himself and promises that his mother will be kinder. She, intrigued, shows him photos of a transsexual who changed gender. That ignites Eddie's imagination, and that night he steals a corpse in search of a ring to propose to Adeline. Days later, in a romantic scene, Eddie surprises her with the proposal. Nervous in the middle of the cemetery, he asks her to be his wife. She, shocked, ends up accepting. Right there, they are about to have sex, but Eddie stops because his mother taught him that fornicating brings children. Adeline tells him she can help him. The next day, she takes him to an orphanage, where he gets a small job taking care of children to see if he could grow fond of them. Eddie tries to appear kind and takes the children to his house, where he does magic tricks using skulls and bones. They get bored, so he, trying to impress them, puts on a woman's skin, terrifying them. When he returns them to their homes, the parents confront him, but he defends himself by saying that he was only trying to entertain them. Soon after, the original babysitter, whom Eddie had impersonated the night before, appears. That same night, Eddie kidnaps her. Days later, he excitedly announces that he is ready to be a father. Adeline, thrilled, agrees to run away with him, although her family opposes it. Already living together, while she tidies up the kitchen, Eddie goes out to hunt dinner. Curious, Adeline enters the mother's room and finds Eddie with the mask made from her face. Back in the present, Anthony, the actor who played Eddie, feels frustrated. Hollywood only recognizes him for that role and no one else hires him. His only option is a sequel, even though he doesn't like it. Alfred, the writer, also faces criticism. His colleagues tell him that that kind of horror no longer sells, that now the trend is sexual horror. He refuses, but upon seeing a film of that genre with his wife, he understands that the audience has changed. Meanwhile, Eddie continues to sink after kidnapping the babysitter. Guilt for ruining his wedding drives him to a point of madness. Together with his dead mother, he begins to torture her until he kills her. The next day, Adeline enters Eddie's mother's room. According to the real story, upon discovering the decomposing corpse, she flees in terror into the woods. Later, they both meet and talk about what happened. Adeline, still terrified, asks Eddie to be honest and explain why he keeps his mother's corpse. Eddie responds coldly that in reality that body is not his mother's, but another woman he dug up, and that his mother's spirit inhabits that body. In the following days, Bernice appears in Eddie's life, a woman who ran a shop in the area. One day, he enters the store and finds her visibly depressed. Moved by curiosity, he decides to invite her to eat. During dinner, they talk so much that she remembers an old youthful love. Eddie, for his part, becomes obsessed with the woman's bust, to the point of asking her to lend him her bra to try it on. At night, they both go out skating, and after sharing a few glasses of wine, they end up having intimate relations. After that encounter, Bernice asks Eddie to move in with her. Confused, he goes to tell his mother, but she scolds him harshly. The next morning, Eddie visits Bernice at her shop. She surprises him with a lunch and gives him several of her favorite bras. However, Eddie, dominated by his mother's words, tells her that he cannot continue with her because her body already passed the disease to him, with the bond broken and his mind distorted. As he leaves, he buys a gun and kills her with a shot. That same night, Eddie looks for Adeline to confess what happened. He tells her that he did something terrible and that he fears she will judge him or abandon him. However, Adeline shows no fear. She simply asks him if the victim tried to resist. Eddie then shows her the corpse of a person cut almost in half. Years later, in Texas, we meet Toby, a man fascinated by Ed Gein's story. His obsession leads him to create a film inspired by his life, which he would title The Texas Massacre. In 1973, Toby manages to carry out the filming of his project, turning into cinema the macabre reality that had marked Eddie's life long before. Returning to Eddie and Adeline, she tells him that she will soon move to New York, and that if she gets a job, she would like him to move in with her. Eddie likes the idea. At that moment, Adeline gives him a gift, some books that she knows he loves. After that, Eddie takes her to his house with the intention of having sex, but Adeline stops him. She tells him that he cannot decide for both of them, and emphasizes that for now, she is not ready to be intimate, much less to become his wife. The refusal enrages Eddie. She, in a tone between ironic and harsh, tells him to look for another who won't say anything to him, a dead one. Moved by that idea, they both go out to the cemetery in search of a fresh corpse so that Eddie can satisfy his impulses. The next day, Eddie begins to get aroused until he has relations with the corpse of a neighbor. Meanwhile, Adeline, already settled in New York, tries to get a job as a photographer. However, she is rejected as soon as the employers see the disturbing photos she presents. Without money and lost in a huge city, she decides to return home. Upon arriving, she tells her mother that things went badly in the city, but in an unexpected twist, her mother reveals something painful. When she was pregnant with her, she tried to abort by throwing herself down the stairs several times. She also tells her to look for a husband who can tolerate her, because if you left once, you cannot come back whenever you want. Struck by those words, Adeline decides to return to Eddie, willing this time to please him. However, the moment he touches her, he tells her coldly, "You are lukewarm." Immediately afterward, he puts her in a bathtub full of ice water. The next day, Frank, Bernice's son, arrives at his mother's shop and finds it completely empty. He immediately feels the worst. when he discovers a large bloodstain on the wall. Desperate, he begins to look for some clue, and among the shelves he finds a gift box with Eddie's name, the same one his mother had mentioned to him. With that evidence, Frank goes to the sheriff, and together they head to Eddie's house. There they discover the unimaginable, a macabre scene with furniture, upholstered with human skin, lamps made with heads, and human remains scattered in different rooms. The scene is heartbreaking. The police begin to raid every corner of the residence while the forensic team photograph and collect evidence. When Eddie returns home, he is surprised to see so many people inside his residence. He does not understand what is happening until he sees the uniforms and the looks of horror. At that very moment, Frank finds his mother decapitated and cut in half. The pain tears him apart and a scream of fury resounds in the house. Out of control, he tries to deliver justice with his own hands, but Eddie is arrested. Later, after completely searching the house, the forensic specialists collect the remains of the victims and work on the reconstruction of Benny's body to be able to hand it over to her family. The next morning, the investigations point to Adeline as a possible accomplice of Eddie. However, she distances herself from all responsibility, assuring that she barely knew him by greetings and denying having taken part in his crimes. Meanwhile, at the police station, Eddie declares that it is all a misunderstanding. He confesses that he used to dig up corpses from the cemetery, but he denies having murdered many people. He even claims not to remember anything about Benice's death. One day later, during a mass in memory of Benice, Frank is still devastated by the loss. The sheriff, moved by his pain, invites him to a Thanksgiving lunch to try to comfort him, although the emptiness and fury in Frank's heart do not manage to go out. Sometime later, Fran decides to sue Eddie with the purpose of taking his farm. He is convinced that, since he was declared mentally incapable and remains in an asylum instead of a prison, it is preferable to keep the property to compensate in part for the damage suffered and obtain compensation. With the case won, Frank keeps all of Eddie's assets and turns the house into a public spectacle, exhibiting what was once the macabre home of the crimes. The money raised is destined for a charitable cause in memory of his mother. However, after returning from an event where he was promoting an auction, Frank receives the news that Eddie's house has been set on fire. The only thing that survives among the ashes is Eddie's old truck. Meanwhile, in the asylum, Eddie seems to adapt to his new life. One day, a nurse gives him a share of the profits obtained from the exhibition of his house, and Eddie asks her to buy 3 radios. One of them is destined for Ilsen, the woman who had been his inspiration. When she receives the gesture, she turns it on and communicates with him. Eddie, moved, confesses to being her most fervent admirer, but the conversation hits him hard. Ilsen says that everything he believed he saw of her was an illusion, that she was used as an image, and that none of that was real. Even so, she advises him not to allow anyone to call him a monster, since deep down, he is still a human being. After that talk, Eddie sinks into despair, finding no comfort for what he has done and for the memories of his victims. Overwhelmed by guilt, Ilsen ends up taking her own life. On the other hand, the second radio reaches Christina, a transsexual person whom Eddie idolized. In their conversations, Eddie confesses his attempts to become a woman, even recounting the extreme methods he used to modify his body. Christina, surprised, confronts him. She tells him that perhaps he was never a woman, but rather an obsessed cinephile, who eroticized the female figure in order to appropriate it. Something very different from being transsexual. Confused and frustrated, Eddie says goodbye, not knowing what to do with his identity or his life. Amid his bewilderment, he meets a new nurse with a strong character. Through the complicity of another worker at the center, he manages to kill her. However, the next day he sees her walking through the asylum corridors, as if nothing had happened. Astonished, he listens to the doctor explain the truth to him. Everything he had experienced in that place, the radio conversations with Nilsen and Christina, and even the murder of the nurse were products of his sick mind. In reality, he himself created those voices and scenes. The diagnosis is clear: schizophrenia. The doctor prescribes medication to control the hallucinations and explains that his perception of 2 realities at the same time is a consequence of his illness. Resigned, Eddie accepts the treatment and begins a new stage inside the asylum, where his own mind has become his greatest prison. Years later, we meet Teddy, a disturbed man who, after becoming obsessed with Ed's story, tries to imitate him by committing atrocious crimes against his victims. The FBI begins to investigate him to stop him before he becomes a greater threat. To do so, they study Teddy's behavior along with other subjects who are also considered followers of Eddie, trying to understand how the mind of someone capable of such acts works. In that search, they reach Eddie himself, who still lives in the asylum. There he confesses that in the past he did terrible things, that not all the victims died by his hands, but he fully acknowledges that what he did was wrong. On the other hand, Richard Peake appears, another of his followers, a man with a deranged mind who idolizes Eddie. Fascinated, he decides to write a letter to his idol. When Eddie receives it, he feels dejected. He understands that his dark example inspired other mentally ill people to continue his legacy. In the letter, Richard tells him that there's a boy named Teddy who plans to massacre more people. With that information, Eddie understands that perhaps for the first time in his life, he can do the right thing. He contacts the police and gives them Teddy's name. Thanks to his testimony, the killer is finally captured and shown on the news. Eddie experiences a strange happiness, convinced that he finally did something good, but that joy is short-lived. His nurse gives him the devastating news. He has stage 4 lung cancer and only a few months left to live. Desolate, he tries to come to terms with his end. One morning he receives an unexpected visit from Adeline. Eddie, hurt, asks her why at the time she denied knowing him, something that wounded him deeply. She then reveals the truth to him. She also suffers from a mental illness similar to schizophrenia. Reading about Eddie's story triggered her own episodes, and she shows him a list of people whom, according to her delusions, she must kill. Surprised and saddened, Eddie replies that he does not want her to follow that path. Before leaving, he confesses that he loves her. Shortly afterward, in the asylum home, he dies, a victim of his illness. Upon awakening in the afterlife, Eddie meets his mother. She welcomes him tenderly and tells him that she is proud of him, that he was never as the movies portrayed him, since deep down he was only a sick human being. Finally, she hugs him and whispers to him, "Only a mother could truly love you." Finished the monster's story.